Basic medical sciences. My name is Philemon Chisororo. As of today, I am in fourth year at Vinnytsia National Medical University in Ukraine. Right, so we are starting anatomy videos, and I will present them according to the syllabus provided by Ukraine Ministry of Public Health. Right, so this is topic 1 and 2. We will talk about anatomical position, planes, axes. We'll talk about anatomical terminology, general information on bones, bone as an organ, skeleton of the human body, the skeleton of the trunk, the vertebral column, and we'll conclude with the common features of the vertebrae. Right, so let's start with anatomical positions. Right, so in anatomy, all structures are described assuming the body is in anatomical position. So what is this? Right, so this is what it means, anatomical position. The body is erect, the eyes look straight to the front, the upper limbs hangs by side of the trunk with palms directed forward. The lower limbs are parallel to the toes, pointing forward. Right, that's the anatomical position. Right, about anatomical planes, you can see here the planes: sagittal plane, coronal plane, transverse plane. Right. Okay, so sagittal plane, the sagittal plane are the imaginary vertical lines passing longitudinally through the body from the front to the back. Right, from the front to the back, front to the back, dividing the body into the right and left half. Right, and the sagittal axis is going down. Right, going down. Right, okay. Then next is the coronal plane. Right, coronal plane, also known as frontal planes, are the imaginary vertical lines passing through the body at right angles to the sagittal plane, parallel to the forehead. Right, so you can see this one. Right, so passing downwards like this. So that's the coronal plane. Right, this one. And the transverse or horizontal planes are the imaginary planes which, in accordance with their names, pass horizontally at right angles to both the sagittal and frontal planes. They divide the body into the upper and lower portion. Right, upper and lower portion. Right, so using the arrows, there are no arrows here, but going to this direction, you can see this direction or this direction. Those are the axes. Right, those are the axes. And going down or to the side, this one going down, also vertical lines. These are the planes. Right, okay. Here is another presentation. Right, so the sagittal plane, you can see it here in red, divides the body into right and left parts. Right, so sagittal plane can be mid-sagittal. Mid-sagittal will pass through the midline, and parasagittal will be off the midline. Right, but same situation, same plane dividing the body into right and left part. The frontal or coronal plane, you can see it here in green. It divides the body into the anterior and posterior parts. Right, anterior and posterior parts. And then we have the transverse or horizontal axis. Right, or plane. Right, so it divides the body into the superior and inferior parts. Right, so the commonly used terms, you need to know them: superior, inferior, cranial, caudal. Right, so this is the anterior view. Right, superior means towards or near the top of the head. Right, it's upper. these are relationship terms, right? And inferior, towards or near the soles of the feet or caudally going down, right? So these are the examples. The hip is inferior to the shoulder, right? The shoulder is superior to the hip, right? The knee is inferior to the hip, and the hip is superior to the knee, right? Okay. Then caudal and cranial, right? So cranial means a head. It's like head and trunk only, towards or near the head. Caudal, towards or near to the tailbone, right? So examples: the shoulder is cranial to the umbilicus, right? Shoulder is somewhere here and the umbilicus is here, right? So the umbilicus is caudal to the shoulder, right? Okay. This is another presentation, right? So the other terms which are very important are proximal and distal, right? And these ones are used in describing mainly like limbs only, right? So proximal, towards or near to the attachment of the limb to the trunk, that's proximal. Near to the attachment to the trunk, to the attachment of the limb to the trunk. And distal is away or further from the attachment of the limb to the trunk, right? So these are the examples. The elbow, right, here is the elbow, is proximal to the wrist. The wrist is here, right? Because level of attachment to the trunk is here, right? So the elbow is proximal to the wrist. And the foot going down here is distal to the thigh. And the thigh is proximal to the foot, right? I hope you understand this relationship. Then there is medial and lateral, right? Medial means closer to the midline of the body, right? So this is the midline, right? An example: the nose is medial to the ear, because here you find the nose and here you find the ear, right? So towards the midline, the nose is medial to the ear, and the ear is lateral to the nose, right? Okay, you can also see here the upper limb, right? The upper limb is lateral to the hip, and the hip is medial to the upper limb, right? You can see here, right? Right, so lateral is further from the midline, and medial closer to the midline of the body. Right, then according to location of organs, depth, this is very important. The superficial and deep, or internal and external, right? Like internal and external are mainly describing the surfaces, and superficial and deep is like the level where the organ is located, whether deeper or superficial, right? Okay, so superficial means closer to the surface of the body, towards the outside, right? And deep means further from the surface, right? It's towards the inside, right? Okay, so here I just have this example, right? Hello Kitty skin is superficial to her bones, and her bones are deep to her skin, right? Again, here is same situation. Hello Kitty's heart is deep to her ribs, and her ribs are superficial to the heart, right? Okay. Right. Now let's talk about the significance of the skeleton, right? So the skeleton has two groups of functions: the mechanical functions and the biological functions, right? Starting with the mechanical functions. The first one is support, right? So support or weight bearing is provided by the attachment of the soft tissues and organs to the different parts of the skeleton. The bone gives shape and support to the bone and resists all forms of stress. The second function, movement, right? Movement is possible because the bones have the structure of long and short levers connected by mobile articulations or joints and set in motion by muscles which are regulated by the nervous system. Wow, this is interesting, right? The third function, the third mechanical function is protection, right? For example, the vertebral canal protects the spinal cord. The skull protects the delicate brain. The thoracic cage protects mainly the vitally important organs of the thoracic cavity, that's heart and lungs. And the pelvis protects the reproductive organs, which are important for continuance of the species. Right, let's talk about the biological functions of the skeleton, right? The biological function of the bone system is associated with the participation of the skeleton in metabolism, particularly mineral metabolism. The skeleton is a reservoir of mineral salts, phosphorus, calcium, iron, etc. The bone stores about 97% of body calcium and phosphorus. This is important in understanding metabolic diseases like rickets and in making diagnosis with radiant energy, that's X-rays and radioactive isotopes. The skeleton also performs the function of hemopoiesis, thus formation of blood cells, since the bone marrow, the medulla osseum, is located within the bones. Right, let's talk about development of the skeleton. How does it develop? The first germ of the endoskeleton in all vertebrae is the notochord, right? It's called what? Chorda dorsalis, which arises from the ectoderm. The notochord is a characteristic sign of the lower representative of the phylum Chordata, notochord Chordata, right? So animals or organisms with a notochord are the lower species in this phylum, right? For example, the lanceolate, whose skeleton is made up of a cord stretching along the dorsal surface of the body and the connective tissue around it, right? Connective tissue around it is point number one, is very important. In the lower species of vertebrates like shark, the connective tissue skeleton is replaced by cartilaginous skeleton, which in turn becomes bony in higher organized vertebrae, like from the tailorfish, from the tailorst fish to the mammals, right? Okay, so in this you can see, I told you, you need to mark connective tissue, cartilaginous skeleton, and with the development of the body, with the development of the bony skeleton, the notochord disappears except for negligible remnants, thus pulpus nucleus, right? So you find it on the intervertebral disc, right? So these are the three important stages: connective tissue, cartilaginous skeleton, and the bony skeleton, right? So here you can see development of different kind of bones, right? Okay, so this cell is the fibroblast, right? Fibroblasts are important for synthesis of collagen, right? In this case, I just want you to understand, right? And so the fibroblast will transform into what? Chondroblast, right? So this is called intramembranous ossification, intramembranous ossifications. And the bones that follow this pathway, it's mainly neurocranium, right? Neurocranium. And they are called what? Primary bones. They're called primary bones, right? So here I told you about this statement. The three stages: the connective tissue, that's membranous, cartilaginous, and bony, right? So these are actually membranous bones. Membranous bones, right? What about the other pathway? The other pathway from fibroblast to chondroblasts. Chondroblast, that's cartilage, and then to osteoblast, that's bone, right? So this is endochondral ossification, and this is like the pathway for the majority of the body, right? Majority of the bones, and also the chondrocranium, right? Okay. Then there are some terms you need to know. I think there are about 4 terms. Okay, let's see. The phylogenesis. Phylogenesis is the evolutionary development of organisms from the lower stages of organization to higher organized vertebrates, thus mammals and human beings, Homo sapiens. Ontogenesis. Ontogenesis is the individual development of organs which last from the moment of fertilization to the time of death. Right, so this whole ontogenesis is divided into what? 2 large periods, and in between those 2 large periods there is birth, right? So what are those 2 periods? The first one is the intrauterine or prenatal, in which the newly conceived organism develops in the mother's womb and lasts from the moment of fertilization to the time of death, time of birth. Okay, and then extrauterine, the extrauterine or postnatal, in which the new individual continues development outside the mother's body, and it lasts from the moment of birth until death. Birth to death, right? Intrauterine is from fertilization to birth, and then extrauterine from what? From birth to death. Okay, the third term, all right, so there are 3 important terms, right? So this one is called anthropogenesis, right? If you know social anthropology. Okay, so anthropogenesis is the formation and development of human being in relation to the development of the society, right? Okay, bone as an organ. Bone, Latin name os, that's one. Osis is plural, right? It's an organ of the living organism consisting of several tissues, among which the bone tissue is most important. The strength of the bone results from combination of 2 main properties, the hardness and elasticity, which are a result of certain chemical substances in the bone itself. Right, so the bone matter consists of 2 types of chemical substances, the organic part and inorganic. Organic is about 28% and mainly osine. Osine is very important here. And then inorganic, about 22%, mainly calcium salts like calcium phosphate. In particular, this one, it takes about 51.04% of the inorganic part, right? So when the bone is exposed to an acid, the calcium phosphate salts dissolves, right? The process is called decalcification, while the organic material remains and preserves the shape of the bone, although it is now soft, right? Okay, so this statement is helping us to understand what? If the bone is subjected to burning, however, the organic material burns away while the inorganic material remains, so as to preserve the shape and the hardness of the bone, although the bone is now fragile, right? So, okay, therefore, the elasticity of the bone is determined by osine, whereas the strength depends on mineral salts, the organic parts. The bones of young children, which contain comparatively greater amounts of osine, are marked by greater pliability, and their fractures are frequently rare. In contrast, in old age, when the proportion of the organic and inorganic materials change in favor of the latter, right? So the inorganic will be high in elders. The bones will be less elastic. Why? Because osine is low, and they will be more fragile. Right. As a result, bone fractures are encountered most frequently in individuals of old ages. Right. The bone also contains vitamins. Vitamin A, D, C. Right. Vitamin A deficiency will lead to abnormal thickness of bones, and the bone cavities and canals will become empty. Lack of salts or vitamin D in the period of growth reduces the bone's hardness and causes deformities of the bones, right? So in children, it will be rickets, and in adults, osteomalacia. Vitamin C. Vitamin C is needed in synthesis of collagen. So the type of collagen is in the bone is called type 1, right? So bone, you can see 1, right? Type 2 is found in cartilage. So you can say cartilage, right? Right, but here stick to this one, right? Vitamin C is needed in the bone for like osteogenesis, right? Okay, right. Let's look at the structure of the bone. The structural unit of the bone, visible with a magnifying lens or light microscope magnification, is the osteon, or the Havesian system. That is a system of bone lamellae arranged concentrically around the canal, around the Havesian canal, containing vessels and nerves, which provides for the metabolism of the bone, right? Okay, I will show you the picture just a moment. The osteons, the structural unit, form a larger element of the bone which is visible to the naked eye on a section of the bone and on radiographs, right? So these are called what? Trabeculae of the bone matter, right? Right, so this is the structure of the bone, right? You can see the structure of the osteon, and on the center there is a Havesian canal, right? So this one is the osteon, this one is the osteon, and on the center you can see the Havesian canal, right? Okay, so if you take a section of the osteon, you can see the concentrical alignment here, right? So outer, this one is called the lamella, and you can see bone maintaining cells, osteocytes, right? And in the middle there is the central canal or Havesian canal, right? And I told you it's responsible for carrying the blood vessels and nerves, right? Okay, and here is on the microscope, right? On the slide, if they give you a slide, mainly in histology, you will see the bone, the structure of the bone. So this one is the osteon, and central canal here in black. All right. Right, so the bone has two main substances, right? The first one is called the compact substance, substantia compacta, right? So this one, it forms if the trabeculae fit tightly together, right? And it's an adaptation to bending and twisting forces. Another substance is called a spongy substance, substantia spongiosa. And this one is formed by loosely arranged trabecula with the bony spores between them resembling a sponge. And this is an adaptation to compressive forces, right? So on compact substance, the trabecula, they fit tightly together, right, to make it compact. Okay, and on spongiosa, if you know a sponge is loose, right? Okay, The distribution of the compact and the spongy substances depends on the function of the bone. The compact substance is found in those bones and those parts of the bones that are concerned predominantly with the function of support, right? That's the stanchion, and movement, levers. For example, the diaphysis of the tubular bone is an example where we find the compact substance. The spongy substance forms in bones or their parts that are large in bulk, but which must be light and at the same time strong. For example, in the epiphysis of the tubular bones. Okay, I will tell you what epiphysis and diaphysis means, right? The trabecula of spongy substance are arranged in lines of the forces of compression and stretching. In accordance with different direction of these forces, the different bones or even their parts will differ in structure. Okay, still on spongy substance, there is diplo, right? Diplo is the spongy substance of the membrane bones of the skull cap. It consists of irregularly shaped bony compartments lying between the two bone tables, right? So on the outside is the outer lamina externa, and the inner lamina interna, also known as the vitreous lamina, that's lamina vitrea. It's very fragile, that's why it's called that, right? Because it fractures more easily than the outer table in the injury to the skull, right? Okay, so here you can see on the outside, you can see the outer lamina externa, and here there is a lamina interna. In between, that's where you find the diplo, right? Diplo here. And you find the canals within this diplo, that's canales diplois, right? Okay, so for orientation, this is the cranium cavity, and then first layer will be this lamina interna, and then outside there is lamina externa. In the middle part, that's where you find what? The diplo. Now let's talk about the bone marrow, medulla osseum, right? The bony compartments of the spongy bones contain the bone marrow, the medulla osseum. In the tubular bones, the bone marrow also fills the central canal, right? So the central canal is also known as what? The medullary cavity, cavitas medullaris. There are two types of bone marrow, the red and yellow. Red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. Right, let's start with the red bone marrow. Red bone marrow, medulla osseum rubra, is seen as a fine red mass of reticular tissues in which meshes, like the cells, meshes are they as the cells directly concerned with hemopoiesis and bone formation, right? So the cells forming the bone are called the osteoblasts, and the cells destroying the bone are called the osteoclasts, and there are also cells which are not there called osteocytes. Osteocytes will maintain the bone structure. Okay, all right, so the red bone marrow is permeated with nerves and blood vessels supplying the nutrients to the marrow and the inner layers of the bone, right? So that's what makes it red. The blood vessels and the blood elements. That's what makes it red. The yellow bone marrow, medulla osseum flava. This yellow bone marrow owes its color to fat cells, right? Because it's mainly composed of the fat cells, the yellow bone marrow. Right, what is the function of this bone marrow? The first function This bone marrow is a primary hematopoietic organ, right? It manufactures blood cells. The bone marrow also participates in biological protection of the organism. It contains reticuloendothelial cells, which are phagocytic in nature and take part in the immune system response of the body, right? Immune response of the body. The bone marrow also take part in nutrition and the development and the growth of the bone. During the development and growth of the organism, when intensified hematopoietic and osteogenetic functions are necessary, the red bone marrow predominates, right? So the red bone marrow, it predominates in embryos, newborns, right? So these ones, they only have red bone marrow, right? With growth of the child, the red bone marrow at many places will undergo atrophy, and is gradually replaced by the yellow bone marrow, which in adults fills the medullary cavity of the tubular bones entirely, right? The red bone marrow persists in the sponge bones, right? In the ends of the sponge bones, right? The red bone marrow persists in the spongy ends of long bones, in the sternum and ribs, vertebra, and also in skull bones, right? So red bone marrow persists in these bones, long bones, the spongy ends of long bones, the sternum, the ribs, vertebrae, and the skull bones, right? So I would like to take a break with you, right? So you can go out, make coffee, and then we'll come back, right? So it's time to pause. Right, let's talk about the periosteum. What is this periosteum? The bone, with the exception of the articular surfaces, is covered with what? With periosteum. Periosteum is a thin, strong, and a pale pink connective tissue membrane which surrounds the bone on the outer surface and is attached to it with connective tissue fibers penetrating the bone through the special canaliculi. There are two layers of periosteum: the outer fibrous layer and the inner bone-forming layer, also known as osteogenetic or the cambial layer, right? Okay, so here you can see the structure of the periosteum, right? So this is the bone, right? And you can see here the fibrous layer here on the outer. You can see the fibrous layer of the periosteum, right? Canaliculi, that's where the vessels also live from the periosteum to the bone, right? You can also see these cells, the osteocytes. Okay, the periosteum, what are the functions? Right, so there's the next are the functions of the periosteum. It is rich in nerves and vessels and contributes therefore to the nutrition of the bone. Nutrients are conveyed by the blood vessels penetrating in great numbers the cortical layer of the bone from the periosteum through the numerous vascular openings. They are called what? Foramina nutritia, right? Or foramina vasculosa. The second function, owing to periosteum, the bones grows in thickness, right? So the growth of the bones is due to osteoblasts, which are located in the inner or cambial layer of the periosteum and adheres to the bone, right? the periosteum, the inner layer, you find what? The fibroblast, the bone-forming cells. The periosteum performs a protective function, right? The articulating surfaces of the bone are free of periosteum. They don't have periosteum, right? And they are covered with articulating cartilage, the cartilago articularis, which is the common structure of hyaline cartilage and referred to as the epiphyseal cartilage, thus cartilago epiphysealis. Right, classification of bones. There are 4 classes: tubular bones, spongy bones, flat bones, and mixed or irregular bones. Right. Tubular bones are further classified into long tubular bones and short tubular bones. And the spongy bones are further classified to long spongy bones, short spongy bones, and sesamoid bones. Right, let's start with the tubular bones. Right, the tubular bones are composed of spongy and compact substance forming a tube with a marrow cavity. Right, so they perform all the 3 functions of the skeleton. That's support, protection, and movement. Right, so the tubular bones perform these 3 functions: support, protection, and movement. Right, so the long tubular bones are the arm bone, the humerus; the forearm bones, the radius and ulna; the thigh bone, the femur; leg bones, that's the fibula and tibia. Right, so here you have the example of a structure of a long tubular bone, right? Okay, so you can see the middle part is called the shaft, right? The shaft or diaphysis. The ends of the bones are called epiphysis. Epiphysis, right? So the epiphysis, depending, like if you remember the terms, if it is towards like towards the trunk, this one it will be proximal epiphysis, and this one down here will be distal epiphysis, right? Then there is an important area of growth called metaphysis. Metaphysis is between the epiphysis and diaphysis, right? And also some bones have what's known as apophysis. Apophysis, those are like prolongations from the epiphysis, right? Though they can be like processes extending from the epiphysis, right? Okay, that's about the long tubular bones. Short tubular bones are metacarpal bones, metatarsal bones, and the phalanges. The second group, the sponge bones. The sponge bones consist mainly of the spongy substance covered with a thin layer of compact substance. The long spongy bones are the ribs and the sternum. The short spongy bones are the carpal bones and the tarsal bones. The sesamoid bones are the kneecap or patella, right, on the knee; the piriform bone, the sesamoid bones of the fingers and toes, right? So let's talk more about these sesamoids, right? The sesamoid bones act as an accessory devices in the wake of the muscles. The sesamoid bones are located in the thickness of the tendons, which they strengthen, and they are close to the joints. They take part in formation of these joints and promote movement in them, but they are not jointed directly to the bones of the skeleton, right? The functions of the sesamoid bones are not definitely known, but the possible functions will be to resist pressure, to reduce friction, and alter the direction of pull of the muscles, right? Sesamoid bones resist pressure, reduce friction, and alter the direction of the muscles. the direction of pull. Right. The third group, the flat bones. The flat bones resembles shallow plates and form boundaries of certain bone cavities. Right. The flat bones of the skull, the frontal and the parietal, are the membrane bones. They perform protective function, and their structure is diplo, if you remember diplo, and they ossify from the connective tissue. The flat bones of girdles, thus the shoulder blades and pelvic bones, perform supportive and protective functions. They consist primarily of spongy substance, and ossification occurs in cartilaginous tissue, right? Mixed bones, mixed or irregular. Mixed bones are formed by the fusion of several parts which differ in function, structure, and development. Examples of mixed bones include vertebra, bones of the base of the skull. Pneumatic bones. Pneumatic bones are very important. You will see a lot of questions concerning them. Certain irregular bones of the skull contain large air spaces lined by epithelium. The examples of pneumatic bones include maxilla, the frontal bone, sphenoid bone, ethmoid bones. They make the skull light in weight. They help in voice resonance, and they act in air conditioning, right? So they act as air conditioning chambers for the inspired air. Right. Let's talk about the human skeleton, right? The skeleton of the human body, right? So it's classified into two: the axial skeleton, skeleton axiale, and the appendicular skeleton, skeleton appendiculare. Right. So the axial skeleton consists of the skeleton of the trunk, thus skeleton truncee, and the skeleton of the cranium, or it's known as the skull. The skeleton of the head is known as the skull or cranium. Right. That's all about the axial skeleton. And in this video, you will see that we will focus on this part, the skeleton truncee, the skeleton of the trunk. Okay. Appendicular skeleton, skeleton appendiculare. You will find the skeleton of the upper limb, skeleton membri superioris, and the skeleton of the lower limb, skeleton membri inferioris. Right. So the skeleton of the trunk consists of three parts: the vertebral column, columna vertebralis, the 12 pairs of ribs are known as costae, and the breastbone or the sternum, right? Latin name is just the sternum, right? So these 12 pairs of the ribs, costae, the sternum, and the 12 thoracic vertebrae form the thoracic cage, that's the thorax or the chest. Right. Let's look at the vertebral column, right? Vertebral column, columna vertebralis. The vertebral column, or simply the spine, has the metameric structure and consists of separate bone segments, the vertebrae, placed one over another in a series. They are short, spongy bones. Right. What are the functions of the spine or the vertebral column? Right. Number one, the spine acts as an axial skeleton supporting the body. That's support. The second one, it protects the spinal cord enclosed in its canal. Right. That's the protective function. And the third, the spine takes part in movements of the head and trunk. That's movement. So if you remember functions of the bone, we said what? Support, protection, and movement. Right. Vertebral column. Right. So you can see it here. Right. So we have cervical vertebra. Cervical vertebra, vertebra cervicalis, they are 7, right? C1 to C7. right? You can see them here, right? C1 to C7. Then the thoracic vertebrae, right? There are 12, right? T1 to T12. You can see them here, from T1 to T12. The next is the lumbar vertebrae lumbalis, right? There are 5, and you can see L1 to L5. And the sacral vertebra, the vertebrae sacralis, they are 5, right? And it's very important because, they usually fuse, right? So forming the sacral bone. And the last is the coccyx, right? Coccygeal vertebrae, vertebra coccygeae, right? They are 1 to 5, 1 to 5, and again they fuse to form the coccyx, that's os coccyx, right? So you can see them here down, sacrum and the coccyx. They are like individual bones in adults, but in babies you may find them as separate vertebrae, right? What are the common features of vertebrae? Right, the vertebrae is the body, corpus vertebrae, right? So you can see here, this is the body, vertebral body, corpus vertebrae, right? Right, you can see it again here, corpus vertebrae, right? The second feature, right, the arcus vertebrae, right? You can see here, arcus vertebrae, this whole part, arcus vertebrae. Next, you see the processes, right? So the processes are these prominences, right? So the first one is the spinous process. Processus spinosus is this spine, right? Processus spinosus. Processus spinosus, okay? The next one is a transverse process. Processus transversus. This one, transverse process. Processus transversus. You find also the superior and inferior articular processes, right? Because you will see, like in most of them, typically you will see a vertebra like one on top of the other, right? So processus articulares superiores and inferiores, and on those inferior, on those superior and inferior articular processes, between them and the vertebral body, you will see a notch, right? Superior vertebral notch here and inferior vertebral notch, right? The incisura vertebralis superior here and incisura vertebralis inferior here. Right, so here is another image. You can see the corpus, that's the body. The spinous process, right, on the arch, you can see the arch here is a lamina and a pedicule. Don't worry, you will see it later. Okay, other structures, you will see them later, but these are like the common features of the vertebrae, right? You can see here the superior articular facet, inferior articular facet, spinous process, the transverse process, right? Okay. So I told you that these vertebrae are one on top of the other, right? So they form what? Intervertebral foramina intervertebralia, right? So this foramina intervertebralia is formed from the notches, right? And the notches of one will be placed on the other, because I told you there is a superior all right. Okay, let's talk about the intervertebral foramina. Intervertebral, like between the vertebrae, there will be foramens, right? So these foramina intervertebralia are formed from the notches, because I told you there is what incisura vertebralis superior and inferior, right? So, okay, let me show you. Okay, here, right, you can see here inferior vertebral notch and superior vertebral notch. So if they are on top of the other, there will be a foramen at each level, right? That's the what? That's the foramina intervertebralia, right? So this foramen transmit the nerves and the vessels of the spinal cord, right? You can see them here, okay? The nerve roots here, and this is the foramen, right? Okay, so this is the end of this lecture. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe, leave a comment in the comment section, and share with your friends, right? Until next time.